Oedipus is a very well-known Greek hero. In fact, he is probably the one Greek hero who is broken free from Greek mythology and become something else entirely. That is, of course, all thanks to the psychologist Sigmund Freud. You see, in the early 20th century, Freud was developing a number of theories on how the human mind worked, and he was very interested in how young humans developed. One of these theories was called the Oedipus complex. Long story short, Freud guessed there were a series of tensions between young boys and both of their parents, which all three were unaware of. According to Freud, a boy had an unconscious attraction to his mother, which Freud claimed was sexual. At the same time, the boy had an unconscious resentment, or even hatred, toward their father, because basically he already had what the boy wished to obtain. Take of that what you will. That's Freud's Oedipus complex. Personally, I think it's a load of bunk, and I'm not going to go more into it. This is not a podcast on psychoanalysis. But in Greek myth, the hero Oedipus unknowingly kills his father and marries his mother. This situation coincidentally matches Freud's theory very well. Naturally, Freud used it as a flashy example to better describe his hypothesized complex to his readers, and he borrowed the hero's name in the process. Because Freud used it as an example, this is what a lot of people today know about the Greek hero Oedipus. However, what you may not know is that what people in Freud's time, and even today, know of the Oedipus story is a very specific version found in an ancient Greek play called Oedipus Rex by the Greek playwright Sophocles. Other works featuring Oedipus stretch back to the 8th century BC, and we know of more than 30 sources for the Oedipus myths. There are epic poems in the style of Homer, tragic plays, lyric poetry, mythographies, and even a comedy. The wider tradition of Greek myth about Oedipus is much more complex than what is only presented by Sophocles in the play Oedipus Rex. For example, Sophocles presents the story as a conflict between parents and child. He is perfectly happy to zoom in on that relationship, as it makes for a good tragedy. In the 20th century, Freud was perfectly happy to keep it that way when he compared the play to his theories. But the wider Oedipus tradition does not just limit itself to the relationship between Oedipus and his parents. The whole story actually covers 4 different generations, and it absolutely bursts with horror, drama, and tragedy. As a whole, this multi-generational story takes place in the ancient Greek city of Thebes, and for that reason is called the Theban Cycle. In this episode, I'm going to start telling this Theban Cycle, and focus on Oedipus and his father, Laius. From there, in the following episodes, I'll move on to Oedipus's children and the following generations. First, let's start with Oedipus's father, Laius. We actually encountered him very briefly in past episodes. Laius is a king of Thebes, but that was not always the case. Laius was the son of Labdacus, who was in turn the grandson of Cadmus, the founder of Thebes. As I went over in episode 32 and 33, Labdacus died when Laius was young. Laius was next in line to become king, but because he was still a young child, a regent ascended to the throne to rule the kingdom until Laius was older. However, the regent was eventually killed, or expelled, by 2 hero twins named Amphion and Zethus. These twins took over Thebes. Brave citizens, loyal to the old royal family, secretly smuggled the young Prince Laius out of the city, and he entered a life of exile. In ancient Greece, exiled princes and aristocrats often traveled to other Greek cities to seek refuge and security from other kings. Laius eventually ended up in Pisa, a city in the Elis region of southern Greece. There he was allowed to live at the royal court of Pelops, the king of Pisa. Time passed, and the twins Amphion and Zethus died. The throne of Thebes was now vacant once again. The Prince Laius, now an older young man, was invited back to become king. Once the Theban crown was sitting on his head, the new Theban king needed a Theban queen. He married a young woman named Jocasta. Jocasta belonged to an aristocratic Theban family. She was the daughter of a nobleman named Menoetius, and the brother of another Theban nobleman named Creon. This guy Creon has popped up on the podcast before. He was the father of Megara, the first wife of the hero Heracles. So Jocasta is related to Heracles' wife. However, like with many family relationships in Greek mythology, there are some discrepancies here across the different versions. Sometimes Jocasta is not Creon's sister, and is instead one of his daughters. Jocasta's name also varies slightly in different sources for these Theban Cycle myths. She is usually called Jocasta, which is the name used by Sophocles, other Athenian playwrights, and some of the later sources like Apollodorus. But in earlier literature from the Archaic period, she is sometimes called Epicasta. This is the name Homer uses for her in the Odyssey. Epicasta, Jocasta, the names are fairly close, but Jocasta is clearly the better known one, so that's the name I'll use for her in these episodes. Anyway, Laius becomes king of Thebes and marries Jocasta, ready to get down to the serious business of ruling an ancient Greek city-state. But, big problem, Laius is cursed. The exact nature of this curse is not clear. Sometimes, like in the version presented by Apollodorus, Laius and Jocasta are cursed with childlessness for a period of time, and Laius goes to an oracle to seek advice and find out how he can get an heir to his throne. However, sometimes this is a much more darker curse and was caused by some nasty things a young Laius did before he became king. As I mentioned before, when a young Laius was in exile, he found refuge at the court of King Pelops. But he didn't just sit around the palace. The price of refuge would have been to become one of Pelops's retainers, to be employed in the palace. So Laius took on the role of being a tutor to Pelops's sons, teaching them how to drive chariots. In doing so, Laius became introduced to Pelops's very handsome son, Chrysippus. Laius became attracted, no, obsessed, with the other young man, and eventually kidnapped and raped him. Chrysippus later died. In one source, he killed himself due to the shame he felt from being violated. In others, his death is linked to his half-brothers and stepmother. Regardless, though, his father Pelops cursed his former house-guest Laius for his criminal behavior. This darker origin story for the curse goes all the way back to the archaic period of ancient Greece. It may have served as the beginning of the epic poem the Oedipodeia, composed in the 8th or 7th century BC. I say may because this poem is unfortunately lost to history. The poem was part of a collection of epics that told the stories of the Theban Cycle, and the Oedipodeia likely covered the stories of Laius and Oedipus. Only a handful of fragments of the poem's text survive. However, an archaic Greek poet named Pisander, who lived around 640 BC, does connect the rape of Chrysippus, the curse, and the Oedipodeia. If that's the case, sometime later, after he is king and married to Jocasta, an already long ago cursed Laius goes to seek advice from an oracle. Now, we can't be absolutely certain what the archaic poem said about why the oracle was needed. It's possible Laius wasn't even aware of Pelops's curse, even though it was driving him towards his destruction. But the easy answer is that Laius went to the Oracle of Delphi to seek guidance on some kind of problem he was having, likely his childlessness. This is certainly what some of the later sources suggest, and it's fairly easy to imagine a young king on a wobbly throne worried about his lack of heirs. In the earliest epic poems, Laius received an oracle's advice, but in these accounts he probably didn't go to the actual Oracle of Delphi. Delphi was not the only oracle in ancient Greece. There were other important places, and there were other ways of learning the gods' will. This was especially the case in the early archaic period, when the Iliad, Odyssey, and the lost Theban poems were being developed. So in these earliest versions of the story, Laius probably went to an oracle, but it was probably not the oracle at Delphi. It's also possible the prophecy came to him in a dream, from reading the spilled intestines of a sacrificed animal, or from watching the movement of birds. All of these were common ways of making predictions of the future in ancient Greece. However it was done, Laius and Jocasta received a prophecy that they were not expecting. It was not a helpful piece of advice telling them how to finally have a child or solve one of life's little problems. The prophecy was instead a terrible warning that their future child was destined to kill his father Laius, and additionally, as it's added in most versions, also sleep with his mother, Jocasta. Laius and Jocasta were horrified. They had not yet had children. They had learned of the prophecy just in time. And then they learned Jocasta was pregnant. Upon learning the terrible fate, Laius and Jocasta decided their baby must not be allowed to survive. Trying to get around the prophecy, in typical Greek myth fashion, the newborn baby was taken out and left exposed on the slopes of Mount Catherion to die. Yet that wasn't enough. Oftentimes, there is an additional detail, that to be absolutely sure the infant boy would die, Laius and Jocasta had its feet bound together and damaged. The name later given to this child, Oedipus, comes from the Greek words for swollen foot, and refers to this damaging. There is also one source that gives an alternate version of the king and queen's attempt to leave their child to die. In this version, the baby was put in a chest, and the chest was thrown into the sea. This is of course the exact same way the hero Perseus was left to die by his grandfather. With Oedipus, this version was probably borrowed from the Perseus story. No matter how it happened, abandoned on a mountainside with a sharp stake through the ankles, or sealed in a dark, low-oxygen box buffeted by sea spray, in traditional Greek myth fashion, the baby did not die. To go with the dominant left-on-a-mountain tradition, the baby Oedipus was found by the neighboring king Polybus of Corinth, adopted and raised as the king's own son in the Corinthian palace. Time passed, and Oedipus grew into a young man. As befitting a hero, he left Corinth to embark on adventure. Eventually, he reached an oracle, and received the same terrible prophecy that Laius and Jocasta heard years before, that he, Oedipus, was fated to kill his father and sleep with his mother. Oedipus is horrified, and decides to not return home to Corinth and instead head to the neighboring city of Thebes in order to avoid the prophecy. Oedipus, after all, did not want to kill Polybus. The timing of this event is a bit muddled across the different surviving versions of the story. In Sophocles' Oedipus Rex play, Oedipus learns that he may not be the real son of Polybus, and so heads out to learn who his father really is. Eventually, he reached the oracle, hears the prophecy, and decides to not return home. But if he already had reasons to suspect he was not Polybus's real son, why did he not go home? That might have been the safest place for him, after all. I guess it's because the oracle didn't actually address his question directly, and didn't tell Oedipus who his father was or wasn't, just that he would kill him. Anyway, either before reaching the oracle or afterwards, Oedipus resumed his traveling. He wandered down a skinny path, just wide enough for a chariot. Sure enough, from around the bend in front of him came a chariot coming towards him. The driver was obviously a very rich man. As he was well dressed, the chariot was richly decorated, and he had an attendant making his way behind him. The man arrogantly tried to drive Oedipus out of the way and into the ditches to the side of the path. Oedipus, who was a prince of Corinth, was not simply going to let this guy have his way. They yelled, they fought. Oedipus killed him. The attendant fled. Oedipus left the man's dead body on the side of the road and continued on his journey. The exact details of the murder are mostly the same in the different sources, with some minor variations. In terms of where it happened, almost all say it happened at a crossroads in Phocis, the part of central Greece where the Oracle of Delphi is located. However, one source, Pisander, suggests the murder may have happened on Mount Catherion. This is very close to Thebes, and is the same mountain where Oedipus was abandoned as a baby. Either way, he is far away from Corinth, and is closer to the bustling ancient metropolis of Thebes, so Oedipus decided to travel there. Oedipus arrived at Thebes to find the city with its king missing and presumed dead, and its people being terrorized by a monster, the Sphinx. Like many monsters in Greek myth, she is a hybrid creature. She has the face of a woman, the body of a lion, and the feathery wings of an eagle. She was also a descendant of the mother and father of many Greek monsters, Echidna, and Typhon. The Sphinx was the daughter of Orthus, a monstrous hound that was the son of Typhon and Echidna. We know the Sphinx was a key part of the Oedipus story from the very beginning. Hesiod's Theogony tells us the Sphinx terrorized Thebes, although he doesn't mention Oedipus. However, surviving fragments from that lost poem, the Oedipodeia, do mention her too. The Sphinx terrorizes the city by asking riddles, and then devours those who fail to answer correctly. Before Oedipus arrives, she has already killed many young people this way. One example of a Greek vase shows several youths deliberating together over a riddle, while the Sphinx looks on. Another vase shows the Sphinx chasing young people. Fragments from the Oedipodeia give us the name of one of her victims, Haman, who is related to Jocasta and Creon. He's usually Creon's son, so this means all of Thebes is suffering. Even the royal family is affected by the crisis. But what is the reason for all the death? The Sphinx may have been sent by Zeus or Hera, possibly as a consequence of Laius's earlier rape of Chrysippus. But there are some problems with that idea. First, it means Thebes as a whole is being punished for the rape of one youth with the murder of countless Theban youths. Not exactly an equal punishment. And why isn't it focused on Laius? He committed the rape. He got Pelops' curse. Why is Thebes being punished? Maybe the Sphinx was terrorizing Thebes longer than we think. Maybe the Sphinx was around when Laius was still king. After all, how long has he even been gone for? Unfortunately, we can't know for sure. And then there's the fact that Laius is now dead. He was the stranger that Oedipus killed on the road. But why is Thebes still being punished? My point here is that there is no satisfactory reason for why the Sphinx is terrorizing Thebes. The rape of Chrysippus explains the curse on Laius and why bad things happen to the family, but it doesn't easily explain the presence of the Sphinx. If you believe the Sphinx showed up after Laius left Thebes, she could very well just be a monster that just happens to be terrorizing the city, like many other monsters throughout Greek mythology. Anyway, Oedipus comes to Thebes and finds the Sphinx perched up on a rock or ruined column. It looks the man up and down, licks its lips, and gives him the famous riddle. What goes on 4 feet in the morning, 2 feet in midday, and 3 feet in the evening? The earliest known quote for the riddle, supposedly by Asclepiades in the mid-4th century BC, is slightly different. It goes like this: that there is a creature that walks with 2 feet, 3 feet, and 4 feet. It has a single voice, and unlike all the animals, it can change its nature. And when it walks on the most feet, its speed is the least. The answer for both is man, because humans walk on 4 feet when they crawl as babies, 2 for most of their lives, and 3 when they need a cane to walk when they are old. Funny enough, this riddle was well known in various parts of the world in historical times. Variations of it are known as far away as Indonesia, the Philippines, and sub-Saharan Africa. What's more, the Sphinx may not have had only one riddle. The 4th century playwright Theodectes gives a different riddle in his mostly lost play about Oedipus. That riddle, which survives, is this: there are 2 sisters, of whom one bears the other, and having borne her, is then born by her. The answer: night and day. So maybe the Sphinx didn't have a single specific riddle she asked every passerby. Maybe she asked different riddles to different victims. Or maybe she played a game of riddles, like Gollum and Bilbo in The Hobbit. While the riddle is the dominant tradition for how the Sphinx is overcome, it's not the only one. There was a version in archaic Greece where the Sphinx is killed like any old monster, with the point of a sharp spear. The Greek poet Carina, who may have lived around 500 BC, specifically says Oedipus killed the Sphinx by force. And there are examples of Greek art from the same time period that show him holding a spear or wielding a big club and facing off with the monster. Some scholars think this was an artistic choice, though, because it's hard to show riddle giving in a 2D drawing. However, at least one vase artist did manage to do just that, and shows Oedipus solving a riddle given to him by the Sphinx, with parts of the riddle actually written on the vase. Going back to the dominant tradition, Oedipus answers the Sphinx's riddle correctly. In the versions of Apollodorus and Diodorus, upon hearing the correct answer, the Sphinx threw itself off a cliff and fell to its death. It's an ending that is a tad ridiculous. Personally, I like to bring the two different versions together and imagine the Sphinx attacking Oedipus after he solved the riddle. But hey, that's me. With the Sphinx dead, Oedipus has now joined the ranks of other monster slayer heroes. As a reward for saving the city, he is married to the widowed queen and allowed to ascend the throne of Thebes and rule as its new king. This of course means Oedipus has unwittingly married his own mother, and while no one has noticed it yet, he is also the reason why the king is missing. So Oedipus's prophesied fate is complete. He has committed both patricide and incest. And yes, to be clear, that is what's going on here. Oedipus killed his own father, and then has sex with his own mother. He didn't just marry her and then turn the older woman into a domestic servant. They have sex. This must be the case. For one thing, marriages in ancient Greece were consummated almost immediately afterwards. If you remember back to the Jason and the Argonaut episodes, Jason and Medea have sex for the first time practically at the end of the ceremony. So saying Oedipus and Jocasta were married is really just the polite way of saying they were sleeping together. But it goes even further. The entire Laius and Oedipus story slowly builds a sense of dread. The curse on the family is slowly magnified, more and more, until it consumes everyone. None of them can escape their fate. It's a terrible lesson, and the original myth surely shows this with the hero marrying his mother and then having children with her. In our later sources, according to Apollodorus and Diodorus, they have not one, not two, but 4 children together. 2 sons named Polynices and Eteocles, and 2 daughters, Ismene and Antigone. Of course, this is not always the case. There are exceptions. The late Greek writer Pausanias takes great pains to say Oedipus and Jocasta did not have children, instead saying Oedipus had them with another woman named Eurygenea. Pausanias even tries to quote the Odyssey and the lost Oedipodeia poem as evidence of this. Part of the problem here has to do with timing. To look at Pausanias' argument, the Odyssey says Oedipus, after killing his father, married his mother. So far, so good. But the Odyssey goes on to say that the gods soon after revealed these things to mankind. Pausanias says that if the gods revealed Oedipus's crimes soon after, then he couldn't have had time to have children with Jocasta. Instead, Pausanias says the Oedipodeia, a poem that would have been composed around the same time as the Iliad, had Eurygenea as the mother. It's a fair argument, although some scholars think Pausanias is making a mistake here, and that Eurygenea could just be another name for Jocasta that was more common in the Archaic period. Bear in mind, the Odyssey doesn't use the name Jocasta, it calls her Epicasta. However, this could still be a bit of a stretch. One other man, Pherecydes, from the 5th century BC, several centuries before Pausanias, says much the same thing as Pausanias. Nevertheless, other sources do have Oedipus and Jocasta having children together. The Odyssey has the gods reveal Oedipus's crimes. It's not clear how they did this, just that they did. Sophocles' Oedipus Rex play has the truth come out in a very dramatic and interesting way. It happens slowly, almost like a modern-day whodunit. The play begins with Oedipus already king of Thebes and married to Jocasta. But Thebes' troubles have not ended. A plague rips through the city. Oedipus sends Creon, Jocasta's brother, to get advice from the Oracle of Delphi. When he returns, Oedipus is told he needs to uncover the murderer of the old king Laius. Oedipus takes on the role of detective, but since this is Greek mythology, he goes to the seer Tiresias and asks him who the murderer is. This goes nowhere, and they get in a big fight. Eventually, Jocasta arrives and tells Oedipus to not take any notice of the seer. Seers, she says, are not all they're cracked up to be. After all, many years ago the old king Laius was told he would be killed by his own son, but instead he was killed by a group of bandits at a crossroads near Delphi. Oedipus grows quiet and asks to see an old shepherd, the only surviving witness of Laius's murder. When Jocasta asks him what's wrong, he tells her why he left his home city of Corinth, the prophecy he received from the Oracle of Delphi, and how, deciding not to return home, he made his way to Thebes, got in an argument on the road, and killed a man at a crossroads. At this point, two people arrive. The first is a messenger from Corinth. He tells Oedipus that his father, the king of Corinth, is dead. Oedipus points out this means half of the prophecy has been averted. He thankfully did not kill his father, but is still worried that he might somehow sleep with his mother. The messenger tells him his mother, the queen of Corinth, is not actually his mother, so he shouldn't worry. The messenger tells Oedipus that he is a foundling, that when he was a baby, a shepherd found him on the slopes of Mount Catharion and brought him to the king of Corinth to raise. The second person who arrived is very important. He is both the shepherd who found a baby Oedipus and the witness of Laius's murder. It is through him that all the strands of this tragedy come together. After Laius received the prophecy about his son killing him, Jocasta gave the baby to the shepherd to be left to die. But the shepherd admitted he didn't do this. Instead, he took the baby to Corinth and gave it to the king there. This is, of course, Oedipus, who is also identified as Laius's murderer. The true terror of it all is revealed. Jocasta, who already guessed what was going on during the explanation, ran into the palace and hung herself. Oedipus, when he realized, took the pins from his mother-wife's clothes and stabbed himself in the eyes with them. He blinds himself, leaves Thebes, and goes into exile. That is how Sophocles ends it. Other sources, like the Odyssey, have Jocasta kill herself but suggest Oedipus remain king, at least for a little while longer. Apparently, the crime of incest is bad enough to make Jocasta commit suicide, but not bad enough to make her son Oedipus no longer worthy to be king. It seems unfair, but Oedipus did not get off free of consequences. In these traditions, Oedipus likely got purified, like many other heroes, Heracles and Peleus, for example, when they do something wrong. The same situation may have applied to Jocasta too. There are some accounts of the myth that have her survive into the next generations. It appears that different poets in different time periods played with the consequences of the big reveal in different ways. The famous blinding of Oedipus, for example, likely originated in the classical period. The first time it is mentioned is in Aeschylus's play called Oedipus. Aeschylus was slightly older than Sophocles. The play by Sophocles is the most well-known version of the Oedipus story. The play is often called Oedipus the King, an English translation of its Latin name, Oedipus Rex. However, in Greek, it's called Oedipus Tyrannus, or Oedipus the Tyrant. Tyrant did not always have the same negative meaning it has today, but I still think Oedipus the Tyrant is a better name for the play. For one thing, it indicates to me a certain Athenian sensibility that was prevalent in the classical period of ancient Greece. In the play, while he is playing detective, Oedipus is logical, but at other times he is raging and paranoid. In other words, he acts like a tyrant. This behavior would have stuck out to the play's original Athenian audiences, who in the classical period looked down on would-be tyrants. This would have made Oedipus appear less a tragic victim of a family curse, but also someone who, maybe, deserved the cruel wills of the gods. Yet for all his crimes, Oedipus was still considered a hero throughout ancient Greece, for a couple reasons. First, he lived during the Age of Heroes, a mythical time when people were considered stronger, better, and more honorable, at least according to the ancient Greeks. Second, Oedipus was the main character of his own epic poem, the Oedipodeia. Only a true hero would have that, and Oedipus had all the other ones made about him too. And finally, Oedipus was one of the mighty dead. These were the dead heroes, often the offspring of gods. In ancient Greece, these larger-than-life figures had roles in the afterlife. They were prayed to by the ancient Greeks. It was believed they acted as intermediaries between the worshipping humans and the Olympian gods. Providing offerings at the graves of these heroes was supposed to help daily life. Oedipus had his own cult, and was actually worshipped across ancient Greece. This cult was also linked to the Erinyes. These were the Furies, the goddesses responsible for revenge and punishment. Even the Oedipus cult was tied to the story of his crimes. And that's all for today. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend. The next episode will carry on with the next installment of the Theban Cycle. So stay tuned, and thank you for listening.